LBJ, Part 3. Hang on, trying to get the lighting better. Didn't work. Anyway, LBJ, Part 3. We were just talking about parts of the Great Society, Medicare, Medicaid, Clean Air Act, etc., etc. But sadly, there's also some things kind of going weird on us. All right. So, which leads us to D, coming apart, the 60s. Okay? A lot of ways it seems like the country is becoming ripped apart by dissension. And there's two main causes here. One, there's continued unrest after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Okay? Because there's still some people who were resistant to it, and then there's other people who think it didn't go far enough. And then there's unrest over the situation in Vietnam, which we will talk about a lot in the rest of this outline. Okay? So, civil rights radicalism. We'll start with this. Okay? So, in some ways, the civil rights movement has reached its goal. You've got the Civil Rights Act, you got the Voting Rights Act, but there's still people who are sluggish to respond, and then there's other people thinking it didn't go well enough or far enough, and you start seeing some elements of it become radical. I remember Martin Luther King Jr. had preached, for all kinds of civil disobedience, but peaceful, you know, Gandhi inspired type protest. Okay, but there's always people who are a little more edgy. Okay, and so the civil rights movement starts getting somewhat radicalized. You see the rise of a group, advocating, or a faction advocating for black power. Let me get you a slide here. Okay. So here are some black athletes at the '68 Olympics. They've won gold and silver medals, or maybe gold and bronze, maybe. And during the playing of the national anthem, or before, they're flashing the Black Power salute. Okay. There were people within the African American community or the black community who felt that this is something that they needed to gain control. The civil rights movement, although it was obviously blacks were extremely active and had a lot of leadership roles, there were also whites working for this. Remember the pictures of the Freedom Riders. Okay, there were whites and blacks. Okay? And so there's some people who go, well, the whites are still running things, and we need to be in charge of it. So you see the rise of groups like the Black Panthers, okay, which is a radical, or most people would consider them radical. I'm sure they didn't, and maybe they did consider themselves radicals, but a little more edgy type, in-your-face, confrontational type protest. This is like where you see Malcolm X, for instance, who's not on the outline here anymore, but you'll probably see him in the book. Okay? He's of that kind of school of thought. Okay? And also happening around this time is there's a lot of civil unrest. Okay? There's a riot in Watts, which is a poor section of Los Angeles. It's kind of like the ghetto section. And so it's economically depressed. And the population is heavily black in the Watts area. So there's an incident, turns ugly. Pretty soon there's rioting in the streets. Things are getting burned. Okay? And so, look at the picture on the right. We have, National Guardsmen are actually having to come out and patrol to maintain order. Okay? So there's, guys in combat gear with rifles and bayonets trying to, restore order. Now, fortunately, something like that could never happen today, right? Yeah, it does. Okay. This is what mobs can get kind of ugly. Okay. Burning down the part of town where you live, probably it doesn't really help you any. But people get angry, they want to vent, and so the next thing you know, the drugstore's burned, and now people can't get their prescriptions. Okay? And to a lot of folks watching at home, particularly people of a more racist mindset, might look at this and say, yeah, see, here is these race riots. This is what happens. Okay? But people who look into this find that it is more economically driven. Now, it just so happens that in these economic areas tend to be largely minority areas. But it doesn't seem to be driven quite as much by black-white issue as it does by the haves and have-nots issue. But a lot of the have-nots in Watts are black, and so the racial overtones creep in. It's just kind of ugliness, frankly. I think we could do without, but it's not really productive in any way. Never to let people know you're angry, but maybe writing a good letter would do for that. I mean, look at this. Here's buildings have been looted. I mean, look at this. I mean, it looks like Berlin in 1945. I mean, just things burned out, walls collapsed. I just don't see how this is really helpful to anybody. People are expressing their rage. And there were, like I said, people who looked into this and found that it was largely socioeconomic driven. Okay? This happens in Watts in 1965. Now, if you're sitting at home watching this on your TV, you're thinking, man, the country's coming apart. All right? And there's more incidences of this. Okay? Detroit in 1967. Okay? Detroit now, of course, Detroit's kind of funky. They burn things down today. If their basketball team wins a championship that goes set things on fire, there's some weird stuff going on with arson in Detroit. And there's even, there should be a slide here. Yeah, here's Washington, 1968. Washington, D.C., the capital. Now, this comes after the assassination of Martin Luther King, which we haven't got to yet. That comes later. The next slide, but that will trigger, of course, a lot of anger and resentment, and people want to act out. Next thing you know, someone's on fire. So certainly, if you're at home, Mr. and Mrs. Middle America living out in the middle of Iowa, or something, and you're watching this on the network news, it seems like wow, riots, riots, riots. It seems like once again the country is becoming polarized and literally like the like says, coming apart at the seams. Okay, so what's going wrong? Now, the other thing that people are upset about is the war in Vietnam. All right. Now, the war in Vietnam, trying to see if I can get this all in one thing. I mean, I'll have to have her split. We'll have to split this in the middle, I'm sure, because it's fairly long. This is Vietnam, this yellow area. Okay, this was French Indochina. French Indochina was like Vietnam, and I think Laos and Cambodia and stuff were part of it as well. It was a French colony prior to World War II. After World War II, remember our World War II lesson, the Japanese had come in and occupied French Indochina during the war. After the war, the French are trying to regain control of this colony, and a lot of people don't want it there. The Vietnamese people are like, well, we really don't need the French telling us how to run things. And so there's this independence movement breaks out against the French. And this is in the 1950s. So when we were in the Eisenhower era, I touched on it and said, hey, we'll get to it later. Well, here it is. So there's our map of Vietnam. Okay? Now, give you a little backstory here. Okay? After the French lost, let me see here. Next slide should be, yeah, here we go. The fellow who, one of the big leaders of the anti-French movement was a guy named Ho Chi Minh. Here's a picture right here. Ho Chi Minh, which I think was a false name if I recall. I think he changed his name to protect his family. Now, Ho Chi Minh had grown up in French Indochina. He'd gone to school in France, if I recall. Now, during World War II, he was one of the people kind of leading the resistance against the Japanese. Okay? He also happens to be a communist. Okay? Now, you can be a nationalist and be a communist. The two are not mutually exclusive. So he's a nationalist, but he wants the French out of Indochina, but he's also a communist. And he's one of the people leading the revolt to try to get the French evicted. Okay? The French will eventually be defeated in the 1950s at a place called Dien Bien Phu. You'll see it up on the top on the slide there. You'll notice on the map, it's up near the very top of the map, next to where it says North Vietnam. Okay? After Dien Bien Phu, the French realize they have to relinquish control of Indochina. And there's this big conference in Geneva. It's called the Geneva Accords. I won't go into a whole lot of detail on it. The book might mention it. in a little bit more detail. But basically, it carved French Indochina into little pieces. You'll notice there's a country called North Vietnam. There's a country called South Vietnam. And the North Vietnam is under the control of Ho Chi Minh and his associates, and it's a communist country. South Vietnam is not communist. Okay. All right. So this is all going to feed back into the Cold War. Okay. Now, keeping an eye on the clock here. Okay, there's pictures of the French and the Vietnamese at Dien Bien Phu. All right. So these Geneva Accords set up these two different Vietnams, and there was a period where people could move and decide where they wanted to live. Of course, that might separate families, but at some point there was supposed to be like a referendum to maybe see about combining the two countries into one. And I don't really, honestly, I'm a little hazy on the details. I've read several books on Vietnam, but it's usually more on the American phase of it. Okay, but these elections never happened. So the guy in charge of South Vietnam, remember, there is no long tradition of government service necessarily in Vietnam because the French have been controlling things. The fellow who's kind of come into power in South Vietnam is a guy named Diem. Okay, I won't try to pronounce his Vietnamese name. Okay, there he is, Diem. There's a picture of him on the cover of Time magazine, or a painting. Okay, Diem is in control of South Vietnam, and we're backing him. We started backing him under the Eisenhower administration. Now, Diem had some issues, but the hope is that if you can keep, some semblance of democracy going, that over time it can develop into something more akin to what we want. Okay, so it's not necessarily that we're fond of Diem, but he sure beats Ho Chi Minh. Because remember, containment. We want to keep communism from spreading. We know if the communists take control of South Vietnam, that things will not go well for the people there. Okay? Historically, it doesn't when the communists take over. So Diem, despite all of his issues, will back him because he's not a communist. So, like I said, it comes back to the containment theory. Okay? And so, under Eisenhower's administration, we had sent advisors to Vietnam to help them set up like an army. Okay, we were training him. How do you maneuver? How do you, maintain equipment? How do you, do the things an army is supposed to do without suppressing the people? That sort of thing. But Diem's got issues. Like I said, he's a bit of an autocrat. He's very, kind of impressed with himself, I suppose. He's got another problem. Diem is a Catholic. Now, there's nothing wrong with being Catholic, okay? But the country of South Vietnam, the majority of the people are Buddhists. Okay? But Diem, when he puts people into government positions, favors Catholics. So a lot of the people in Vietnam don't feel that they're properly represented. Buddhists are a majority of the country, but yet it's being controlled by a Catholic minority. And this will cause some angst. And so a resistance movement will spring up against Diem. It's called the National Liberation Front, but the South Vietnamese call them the Viet Cong, as in Vietnamese communists. Okay? Now, this group is backed by the North. The North would like to destabilize the South. It's not that stable anyway. They're trying. We would like to see it develop and grow into something a little more democratic. Okay. And the North Vietnamese would like to destabilize it. So the Viet Cong, although it's a largely indigenous, reaction to Diem, it's being backed by the communists in the North. They're filtering supplies and men to do training and that sort of thing. So the Viet Cong are working to overthrow the South Vietnamese government. Okay? And we're, of course, continuing to send advisors. Now, Kennedy had sent advisors into Vietnam. Eisenhower sent advisors, and Kennedy had increased the number. Okay? So we'll pick up with that in the next video.